The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath Admiral Chester William Nimitz's weathered hands as he gripped the rail of his flagship the morning of June 4th, 1940, to painting the horizon in shades of amber and crimson. 6 months after Pearl Harbor's devastation, the United States Navy stood at the precipice of either redemption or complete annihilation in the Pacific theater. Intelligence intercepts had revealed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's master plan, a massive assault on Midway atoll that would draw out the remaining American fleet for a decisive engagement. Commander Joseph John Rochefort's cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor had cracked the Japanese naval code, providing Nimitz with an unprecedented advantage. The intercepts revealed that Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, the same carrier force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, was approaching with four fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These floating fortresses carried over 150 aircraft, manned by Japan's most experienced naval aviators, pilots who had dominated the skies. From Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies, Captain Mark Andrew Mitcher stood on the bridge of USS Hornet, his eyes scanning the pre-dawn darkness. The American force was outnumbered and outgunned, with only 3 operational carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. The mathematical odds favored the Japanese overwhelmingly, yet Mitcher knew that in naval warfare, positioning and timing could overcome raw firepower. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey Jr. reviewed his flight plans aboard Enterprise, his squadron of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers representing America's primary striking force. These aircraft, though slower than their Japanese counterparts, possessed a crucial advantage: their ability to deliver devastating blows against enemy vessels from high altitude. The Dauntless had proven its worth at Coral Sea, but Midway would test both machine and pilot beyond all previous limits. According to Naval History and Heritage Command archives, the American forces at Midway comprised approximately 360 aircraft against Japan's approximately 250 carrier-based planes and 100 land-based aircraft. On Midway itself, Marine Corps aviators prepared their antiquated aircraft for what many believed would be a suicide mission. Captain Richard Fleming and his fellow Marines knew their Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters were no match for the Japanese Zero, yet they remained determined to defend their tiny coral outpost. The island's strategic importance transcended its modest size. Whoever controlled Midway controlled the Central Pacific approaches to Hawaii and the American West Coast. As sunrise approached, radar operators on Midway detected the incoming Japanese strike force. Lieutenant Colonel Ira Kimes immediately scrambled his fighters, knowing full well that his obsolete aircraft faced overwhelming odds. The Americans had learned bitter lessons about Japanese capabilities, but they had also discovered that courage and determination could compensate for inferior equipment. When combined with superior intelligence and tactical planning, the stage was set for what would become the most decisive naval engagement in Pacific history, where American ingenuity would clash against Japanese experience, and where the outcome would determine the fate of two nations locked in mortal combat across the world's largest ocean. At 0 for 30 hours on June 4, 1942, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched his first wave against Midway atoll. 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima B-5 N-Kate bombers, 36 Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6 M0 fighters roared from the decks of his four carriers. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led this devastating formation toward what the Japanese believed would be an easy preliminary target before the main American fleet arrived. The Japanese strike force approached Midway with the confidence born of 6 months of unbroken victories. These were the same pilots who had surprised Pearl Harbor, devastated the British Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean, and dominated every engagement from Wake Island to the Dutch East Indies. Their aircraft represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval aviation, fast, maneuverable, and flown by veterans whose skills had been honed in the crucible of actual combat. Captain Simard's radar operators on Midway tracked the approaching formation, while Marine fighters climbed desperately to intercept. Major Floyd Parks led his squadron of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats into what veteran pilots knew would be a nearly hopeless engagement. The mathematical reality was stark: 26 Marine fighters against 36 Japanese Zeros, with the Americans flying aircraft that were demonstrably inferior in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability. The aerial engagement over Midway demonstrated both American courage and the harsh realities of technological disparity. Captain John Carey's Buffalo was shot down within minutes of contact, while Lieutenant Charles Hughes managed to damage a Zero before his own aircraft was riddled with cannon fire. The Marine pilots fought with desperate valor, but 15 of their 26 fighters were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The Japanese lost only to aircraft in the aerial combat, their Zeros proving once again their dominance in dogfighting. Despite the Marine fighters' sacrifice, Tomonaga's bombers reached Midway and delivered their payload with devastating accuracy. The airfield, fuel storage facilities, and defensive positions absorbed tremendous damage. However, the Japanese strike had not achieved complete destruction. Midway remained operational, and its aircraft could still launch counterattacks. This partial success would have profound consequences as the battle developed. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney, Jr. led Midway's land-based bombers in a desperate counterattack against the Japanese fleet, his mixed formation of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, Martin B-26 Marauders, and Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers represented every available American aircraft on the atoll. These obsolescent machines, flown by crews with minimal combat experience, faced the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of the entire Japanese carrier task force. The American attack from Midway achieved little material damage but provided crucial intelligence about Japanese dispositions. High-altitude bombing from the B-17s proved ineffective against maneuvering ships, while the low-altitude torpedo attacks resulted in catastrophic losses. However, these attacks convinced Admiral Nagumo that Midway required a second strike to neutralize its remaining defenses completely. At 07:15 hours, Nagumo made the fateful decision that would determine the battle's outcome. Observing that his first strike had not completely neutralized Midway, and receiving Lieutenant Tomonaga's radio message requesting another attack on the atoll, Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with land attack ordnance instead of armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes suitable for engaging enemy warships. This decision reflected Japanese tactical doctrine and Nagumo's experience from previous operations. However, it also demonstrated a crucial weakness in Japanese planning: the inability to maintain readiness for multiple contingencies simultaneously. As his aircraft handlers began the time-consuming process of switching ordnance, Nagumo remained unaware that American carrier forces were already within striking distance. Having achieved perfect tactical surprise through superior intelligence and aggressive positioning, the morning of June 4th had begun with apparent Japanese success. But the seeds of disaster had already been planted in the decision to prioritize Midway over fleet engagement preparations. At 07:28 hours, the Japanese cruiser Tone's reconnaissance aircraft transmitted a message that would change the course of the Pacific War. Have sighted 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distanced 140 miles from Midway. Admiral Nagumo's tactical situation transformed instantly from confident attack to desperate crisis management. The American fleet had achieved complete strategic surprise, arriving exactly when Japanese aircraft were most vulnerable, caught between missions. With their ordnance configurations in flux, Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey Jr. led Enterprise's Air Group 6 toward the last known position of the Japanese fleet. His 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, representing the spearhead of American striking power. Navigation over the featureless Pacific tested even experienced aviators, and McCluskey's decision-making would prove crucial as fuel gauges showed diminishing reserves. The American pilots flew outdated aircraft compared to Japanese standards, but their training emphasized precision bombing and coordinated attack skills that would prove decisive in the coming engagement. Aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced an agonizing decision: His flight decks were cluttered with aircraft in various stages of rearming. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden surfaces, and aviation ordnance lay exposed throughout the hangar bays. The ideal solution would be to launch immediately against the American carriers, but the practical reality demanded time to complete rearming, time to organize strike formations, and time that the approaching American bombers would not provide. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise in the first American attack against the Japanese carriers. His 14 Douglas TBD Devastators approached. At low altitude, their obsolete torpedoes requiring close range, launches that exposed the slow-moving aircraft to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Japanese Zero fighters, already airborne from combat air patrol duties, pounced on the vulnerable torpedo bombers with devastating effect. The slaughter of the American torpedo squadrons represented one of the war's most tragic examples of courage. Overcoming tactical wisdom, Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, was virtually annihilated. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life preserver to witness the battle's climactic moments. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, suffered equally catastrophic losses. These attacks achieved no hits on Japanese ships, but drew their fighter cover down to sea level. Naval Aviation Museum records indicate that of the 41 American torpedo bombers launched that morning, only 6 returned to their carriers, representing an 85% casualty rate, one of the highest loss percentages for any single mission in naval aviation history. At precisely 10:22 hours, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey spotted the Japanese fleet. His elevated position 10,000 feet above the enemy carriers provided the tactical advantage that would transform American sacrifice into decisive victory. The Japanese fighters remained at low altitude, having just finished destroying the torpedo bombers, while anti-aircraft gunners focused on threats at sea level. McCluskey's dive bombers approached from the sun, achieving complete tactical surprise against targets that had nowhere to hide on the open ocean. The mathematics of dive bombing favored accuracy over speed. Each Douglas Dauntless carried a single 1,000-pound bomb, and their steep diving approach 70 degrees from horizontal made them extremely difficult targets for anti-aircraft guns designed primarily for horizontal fire. Japanese carriers, built for speed and aircraft capacity rather than armored protection, were particularly vulnerable to precision bombing attacks that could penetrate flight decks and detonate in hangar spaces filled with aviation fuel and ordnance. Lieutenant Richard Best selected Akagi as his target, diving through increasingly intense anti-aircraft fire toward the Japanese flagship. His bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated among aircraft being prepared for launch, triggering secondary explosions that would ultimately doom the carrier. Simultaneously, other Enterprise dive bombers attacked Kaga with similar devastating results. The concentrated American attack lasted less than 6 minutes, but achieved what months of previous Pacific combat had failed to accomplish: the neutralization of Japanese carrier aviation superiority. The moment of truth had arrived, and American precision had overcome Japanese firepower through superior positioning and timing. The destruction wrought upon the Japanese carrier force in those 6 decisive minutes of 10:22 to 10:28 hours represented the most dramatic reversal of fortune in naval warfare history. Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship and symbol of Japanese naval dominance, burned fiercely as aviation gasoline and ordnance created an inferno that spread throughout the ship. Captain Taijiro Aoki fought desperately to save his vessel, but the fires had reached the torpedo and bomb storage areas, making further explosions inevitable. Kaga suffered an equally catastrophic fate under the precision bombing of Lieutenant Commander Richard Best's squadron. For direct hits transformed Japan's second-largest carrier into a floating crematorium, her flight deck blown apart and her hangar deck consumed by fires that her damage control parties could not contain. The carrier that had launched aircraft against Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now listed heavily to port, her aviation fuel creating an oil slick that burned on the ocean's surface around her hull. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's bombing Squadron 3 against the carrier Soryu with devastating precision. His 17 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers achieved 3 direct hits that penetrated the flight deck and detonated among fully fueled aircraft preparing for launch. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto remained aboard his burning ship and, according to Japanese survivors, went down with Soryu while singing the Japanese national anthem, a testament to the Bushido Code that governed Imperial Navy officers. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara, faced the complete collapse of his striking force. 3 of his 4 fleet carriers were burning hulks, their air groups either destroyed on deck or trapped aboard sinking ships. The mathematical reality of carrier warfare had shifted instantly. Where Japan had possessed overwhelming numerical superiority that morning, they now faced American forces with only 1 operational flight deck remaining. The carrier Hiryu, under Captain Tomio Kaku, represented Japan's final hope for salvaging victory from the disaster. Her aircraft had been conducting combat air patrol duties and thus survived the American bombing attack that devastated her sister ships. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from Hiryu, immediately ordered a counterattack against the American fleet, knowing that aggressive action represented his only chance to even the odds. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Valdive bombers and 60 fighters from Hiryu toward the American task force, guided by reports from Japanese reconnaissance aircraft that had located Yorktown. The American carrier, still bearing damage from the Battle of the Coral Sea despite hurried repairs at Pearl Harbor, presented an attractive target for pilots seeking revenge for their devastated fleet. Yorktown's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 11:55 hours, providing sufficient warning for Captain Elliot Buckmaster to prepare his ship for battle. The carrier's fighter direction officer vectored 8 Grumman Wildcats to intercept the Japanese formation, but the odds remained heavily stacked against the Americans. Japanese pilots, though fewer in number than that morning, retained their qualitative superiority and combat experience. According to the official action report filed by Captain Buckmaster, archived at the Naval History and Heritage Command, Yorktown's crew achieved a remarkable degree of damage control efficiency, restoring the ship to operational status within 2 hours despite 3 bomb hits. The Japanese attack on Yorktown demonstrated both the continuing skill of Imperial Navy aviators and the improved defensive capabilities of American carriers. 3 bombs penetrated Yorktown's flight deck, starting fires and disrupting operations. But the ship's damage control parties managed to restore her to operational status. With remarkable speed, the carrier resumed launching and recovering aircraft, even as repair crews worked to patch bomb damage, a testament to American industrial engineering and crew training. However, Admiral Yamaguchi was not finished. At 14:30 hours, he launched a second strike from Hiryu 10K torpedo bombers and 60 escorts under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway. This force approached Yorktown from multiple directions, executing a coordinated torpedo attack that American defenders found extremely difficult to counter. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, flooding her engine rooms and causing a severe list that made further flight operations impossible. The carrier that had survived Coral Sea and contributed to the morning's decisive victory now lay dead in the water, her crew preparing for possible abandonment. The battle's outcome still hung in balance, dependent upon whether American forces could eliminate Japan's final operational carrier before Hiryu could launch additional strikes. As Yorktown lay crippled and listing in the afternoon sun of June 4th, 1942, the responsibility for completing America's victory fell upon the remaining air groups of Enterprise and Hornet. Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from Enterprise, faced the critical decision of whether to launch an immediate counterattack against Hiryu or wait for more favorable conditions. The Japanese carrier remained operational and dangerous, capable of launching additional strikes that could further damage American forces. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey, despite fuel exhaustion from the morning's attack, volunteered to lead Enterprise's second strike against the remaining Japanese carrier, his 24 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, accompanied by Lieutenant Samuel Adams's 14 aircraft from Yorktown's displaced air group, represented the concentrated striking power of two American carriers focused on a single target. The mathematical advantage now favored the Americans' 38 dive bombers against one enemy carrier, with limited fighter protection. The search for Hiryu tested American navigation skills and tactical patience. Unlike the morning engagement where smoke columns had marked Japanese positions, Admiral Yamaguchi had maintained radio silence and course changes. That made his carrier difficult to locate. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey relied on dead reckoning and educated guesswork, flying search patterns that consumed precious fuel while the afternoon sun moved inexorably toward the western horizon. At 17:05 hours, Enterprise's scouts located Hiryu steaming at high speed with her escorts, approximately 100 miles northwest of the American fleet. The Japanese carrier was preparing to launch a third strike against American forces, her flight deck crowded with aircraft and aviation personnel who believed they might still achieve tactical surprise. Captain Tomio Kaku had managed to maintain his ship's operational capability, despite the destruction of Japan's other carriers, and his crew worked with desperate efficiency to arm and fuel their remaining aircraft. McCluskey's dive bombers approached Hiryu from 17,000 feet, achieving the same tactical surprise that had proved so devastating against Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu earlier that morning. Japanese fighters, caught at low altitude while providing close escort for their carrier, could not climb quickly enough to intercept the American attack formation. The anti-aircraft fire from Hiryu and her escorts filled the sky with black bursts, but the steep diving angle of the Dauntless bombers made them difficult targets for gunners trained primarily on horizontal attacks. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's bomb struck Hiryu's forward flight deck, penetrating to the hangar bay where it detonated. Among fueled and armed aircraft, the explosion triggered secondary fires that spread rapidly throughout the ship's forward sections, while Lieutenant Norman Kleiss scored a second direct hit that disabled the carrier's steering mechanism. Within minutes, Japan's final operational carrier was transformed into a burning wreck. Her ability to conduct further offensive operations permanently ended. The official war diary of the USS Enterprise, preserved in National Archives records, indicates that American dive bomber accuracy during the Battle of Midway exceeded all previous training standards, with direct hit percentages approaching 30%, nearly triple the rate achieved in peacetime exercises. Admiral Yamaguchi, faced with the complete destruction of his striking force, made the decision to remain aboard his flagship rather than transfer to another vessel. His final radio message to Admiral Yamamoto's Combined Fleet Headquarters reported Hiryu's condition and recommended the immediate withdrawal of all Japanese forces from the Midway operation. The admiral who had commanded Japan's most successful carrier division chose to share the fate of his ship and crew rather than survive the disaster that had befallen the Imperial Navy. Captain Kaku ordered Hiryu's abandonment at 0 to 30 hours on June 5th, after damage control efforts had failed to contain the fires spreading throughout the ship. The carrier that had launched the attacks against Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and Darwin now joined her sister ships as a victim of American precision bombing. Her loss represented not merely the destruction of a single vessel, but the elimination of Japan's trained carrier pilots aviators whose experience could not be quickly replaced. As darkness fell across the Pacific on June 4th, the strategic balance of naval power had shifted decisively. Japan's combined fleet, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months with apparent invincibility, now faced the reality that their most experienced carrier pilots lay dead in the waters around Midway. The industrial capacity that would determine the war's ultimate outcome favored America overwhelmingly, and Japan had lost the qualitative advantage in naval aviation that had compensated for numerical inferiority. The final assault on Hiryu completed the tactical destruction of Japanese carrier aviation, but the strategic implications would only become apparent in the months and years that followed, as America's industrial capacity began producing the ships and aircraft that would carry the war westward across the Pacific. Dawn on June 5th, 1942, revealed the full scope of the disaster that had befallen the Imperial Japanese Navy. For fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu lay beneath the Pacific's surface, taking with them over 3,000 experienced naval personnel and more than 200 aircraft. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship Yamato, faced the most catastrophic defeat in Japanese naval history. His carefully planned operation to destroy American carrier forces having resulted in the decimation of his own striking power. The human cost of Japan's defeat extended far beyond mere statistics. Captain Jisaku Okada of Kaga, Commander Takashi Jigusa, Japan's most skilled dive bomber leader, and hundreds of veteran pilots, whose skills had been honed through years of combat experience, now rested in eternal silence beneath the waves. These men represented an irreplaceable resource that Japan's training programs could not quickly regenerate, their loss creating a qualitative gap in naval aviation that would only widen as the war progressed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing battle reports at Pearl Harbor, recognized that American forces had achieved more than tactical victory. They had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific theater. The Japanese Navy, which had appeared invincible since Pearl Harbor, had demonstrated critical vulnerabilities in doctrine, training, and industrial capacity. Most significantly, Japan's inability to replace experienced carrier pilots would prove decisive in future engagements. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's after-action reports revealed the tactical innovations that had made American victory possible despite numerical inferiority. The coordination between different air groups, achieved through superior intelligence and communication procedures, had concentrated American striking power against Japanese carriers at precisely the moment when they were most vulnerable. The timing had been perfect. Japanese aircraft caught between missions, fighter cover drawn down to sea level, and damage control preparations inadequate for the scale of destruction that precision bombing could achieve. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's combined fleet had lost not only its most experienced carrier air groups, but also the strategic initiative that had characterized the first 6 months of the Pacific War. Future Japanese operations would be constrained by the need to rebuild carrier aviation capabilities, while American industrial production accelerated the construction of new carriers, aircraft, and pilot training programs. Captain Mark Mitcher's analysis of the battle emphasized the decisive role that intelligence had played in American success. The ability to position forces advantageously, achieved through cryptographic breakthroughs and careful operational planning, had overcome significant disadvantage in numbers and individual aircraft performance. The lesson would influence American naval strategy. Throughout the remainder of the war, superior information could compensate for material deficiencies when combined with aggressive tactical execution, according to declassified records from the Naval Security Group Command. The intelligence advantage gained through Japanese code breaking provided American commanders with detailed knowledge of enemy intentions, force compositions, and operational timelines, advantages that proved decisive in achieving tactical surprise. At the critical moment, the Battle of Midway also demonstrated the vulnerability of aircraft carriers to precision attack, a lesson that would influence naval design and tactics for decades to come. The concentration of aviation fuel, ordnance, and aircraft on carrier flight decks created inherent vulnerabilities that superior damage control procedures could mitigate, but not eliminate entirely. Future carrier designs would incorporate lessons learned from the destruction of Japanese carriers, emphasizing compartmentalization, fire suppression systems, and damage control training. Admiral Yamamoto's decision to withdraw his remaining forces from the Midway operation reflected the mathematical reality that Japan could not sustain losses at the rate experienced on June 4th. The combined fleet retained significant striking power in battleships and cruisers, but without carrier aviation to provide reconnaissance and air cover, surface forces remained vulnerable to land-based aircraft and submarine attacks. The strategic offensive that had begun at Pearl Harbor had been permanently halted. The aftermath of Midway would see both navies reorganizing their strategies and priorities. Japan would attempt to rebuild carrier aviation capabilities while establishing defensive positions across the Central Pacific, hoping to inflict sufficient casualties on advancing American forces to negotiate a favorable peace settlement. The United States would accelerate carrier construction and pilot training programs, recognizing that the path to victory required sustained offensive operations. Across thousands of miles of ocean, the reckoning at Midway had determined not merely the outcome of a single battle, but the trajectory of the entire Pacific War, establishing American naval aviation as the dominant force in carrier operations, and beginning Japan's long retreat toward the home islands. 6 months after Pearl Harbor's devastating surprise attack, the waters around Midway Atoll had witnessed the complete reversal of Pacific naval supremacy. The battle that Admiral Yamamoto had conceived as Japan's decisive victory had instead become the turning point that would ultimately lead to imperial defeat. As rescue operations concluded and damaged ships limped back to their home ports, the full magnitude of what had transpired on June 4, 1942, began to reshape strategic thinking on both sides of the Pacific. The statistical comparison between Japanese and American losses revealed the battle's decisive nature. Japan had lost for fleet carriers 1 heavy cruiser, 3,250 personnel, and most critically, the majority of her experienced carrier pilots. American losses, while significant, paled in comparison: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel. More importantly, the United States retained the industrial capacity and training infrastructure necessary to replace these losses within months rather than years. Captain Joseph Rochefort's intelligence team at Pearl Harbor had achieved perhaps the greatest cryptographic victory in naval history, providing American commanders with detailed knowledge of Japanese plans that enabled perfect strategic positioning. The ability to concentrate inferior forces against superior enemies at precisely the right time and place had demonstrated that information warfare could be as decisive as firepower in modern naval combat. Future American operations would continue to benefit from superior intelligence gathering and analysis capabilities. The tactical lessons of Midway influenced naval aviation doctrine for decades to come. The devastating effectiveness of dive bombing attacks against aircraft carriers established the SBD Dauntless as one of the war's most successful aircraft designs, while the catastrophic losses suffered by torpedo bombers led to the development of new tactics and equipment. The coordination required between different types of aircraft fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes became a central focus of American training programs. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's navigation and tactical decision-making during the critical morning attack became a case study in naval leadership. Under extreme pressure, his ability to locate the Japanese fleet despite fuel shortages and navigational uncertainties, followed by the decision to attack immediately rather than wait for more favorable conditions, exemplified the aggressive spirit that would characterize American naval operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. The human stories that emerged from Midway illustrated both the courage and sacrifice inherent in naval aviation. Ensign George Gay's survival after Torpedo Squadron 8's destruction provided eyewitness testimony to Japanese vulnerability during the decisive dive bombing attacks. His account of watching Japanese carriers burning and sinking while floating in his life preserver became one of the war's most compelling survival stories. Historian Gordon Pranger's analysis, published in Miracle at Midway and based on extensive interviews with battle participants, concluded that the American victory resulted from a combination of superior intelligence, tactical flexibility, individual courage, and favorable timing that created opportunities which skilled commanders exploited to maximum advantage. The industrial implications of Midway extended far beyond immediate tactical results. American shipyards were already launching new aircraft carriers at monthly intervals, while pilot training programs graduated thousands of new aviators annually. Japan's industrial base, constrained by resource shortages and competing priorities, could not match this production rate. The Battle of Midway had eliminated Japan's margin of qualitative superiority just as American quantitative advantages began to manifest. Admiral Nimitz's post-battle assessment recognized that Midway had created opportunities for offensive operations that would carry American forces across the Central Pacific toward Japan itself. The upcoming campaigns in the Solomon Islands, Marshall Islands, and Philippine Sea would build upon tactical and strategic lessons learned during the 4 days around Midway Atoll. Each subsequent engagement would further demonstrate American advantages in industrial capacity, technological innovation, and operational flexibility. The legacy of Midway transcended its immediate military significance to become a symbol of democratic determination and industrial capability triumphing over authoritarian aggression. The battle demonstrated that technological sophistication and tactical skill could overcome apparent material disadvantages when combined with superior intelligence and strategic planning. The young democracy that had been surprised at Pearl Harbor had learned to fight with unprecedented effectiveness. As the Pacific War continued toward its inevitable conclusion, the principles established at Midway, intelligence-driven operations, coordinated air-sea tactics, and aggressive exploitation of tactical advantages would guide American strategy. From the Solomon Islands to Tokyo Bay, the firepower that Japan had accumulated through years of preparation meant nothing when American bombers took the sky with precision, coordination, and the industrial backing of a fully mobilized nation determined to achieve complete victory. The dawn that rose over Midway on June 5, 1942, illuminated a Pacific Ocean where American naval aviation had achieved permanent ascendancy, beginning the long journey toward victory that would culminate in Tokyo Bay 3 years later.